Dwight Eisenhower warned America about the military-industrial complex. But what if the warning mattered less than the 8 years that came before it? What if the military-industrial complex didn't grow despite Eisenhower, but because of how well he ran it? Dwight Eisenhower is usually remembered as a warning voice, the general who became president, the leader who cautioned America about the military-industrial complex. Their reputation is comforting. It allows us to admire Eisenhower's insight without asking how much power he actually exercised, or what he chose not to do. This video takes a different approach. Eisenhower was not an outsider confronting a dangerous system. He was one of its most capable managers. He believed deeply in coordination, expertise, and institutional order, and he governed at the moment when temporary emergency had already hardened into permanent structure. This episode asks a harder question than whether Eisenhower warned us. It asks whether his leadership helped legitimize the very system he later cautioned against. If the emergency national security state needed a president to normalize its existence, Dwight D. Eisenhower was almost ideal. He was not an ideologue. He was not a populist. He did not govern through spectacle. He governed through management. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower mastered coalition politics, logistics at enormous scale, and bureaucratic coordination under pressure. He learned how to balance competing interests without ever fully resolving them. This mattered. Eisenhower did not see administration as a necessary evil. He saw it as a virtue. Stability mattered more than transformation. Continuity mattered more than rupture. He did not reject the logic of permanent readiness. He embodied it. By the time Eisenhower entered office in 1953, the United States was already operating under a new normal. He inherited NATO as a permanent alliance, the National Security Council as routine governance, the CIA as a standing instrument of policy, global military bases across Europe and Asia, containment as unquestioned doctrine, and emergency defense budgets as ordinary practice. These were no longer wartime measures. They were peacetime defaults. Eisenhower did not dismantle these structures. He professionalized them. And very early in his presidency, those tools were put to use. In 1953, the United States participated in a covert operation that removed Iran's elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah to power. The following year, in 1954, a similar operation in Guatemala overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz. These actions were not treated as extraordinary. They were framed as efficient uses of power, quiet, deniable, and effective. They avoided open war. They avoided public debate. And they demonstrated how the machinery of permanent emergency could be deployed far beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower did not merely inherit these instruments, he authorized their use. Eisenhower is often praised for restraint, and that praise is not entirely misplaced. He resisted large-scale conventional war, emotional escalation, and constant troop mobilization. But restraint did not mean rollback. It meant reconfiguration. Under Eisenhower, covert action replaced declared war, intelligence agencies replaced public justification, and proxy conflicts replaced decisive confrontation. The Korean War illustrates this shift clearly. In 1953, Eisenhower helped bring about an armistice in Korea, not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. The war ended without resolution, The conflict was frozen in place. This became a model. Containment no longer required victory. It required endurance. Eisenhower did not end the system of war. He made it manageable. Eisenhower believed deeply in planning. Early in his presidency, he convened Project Solarium, a strategic exercise within the National Security Council, designed to explore long-term approaches to containment. On the surface, this looked like prudence, and in many ways it was. But Solarium also revealed something deeper. What began as contingency planning became a template for permanent governance. Strategy was no longer episodic. It was continuous. The emergency was no longer an exception. It became the framework within which policy was made. One of the most important shifts under Eisenhower was not military or technological. It was political. Power increasingly justified itself not through public consent, but through competence. Decisions were framed as technical necessities, not moral or political choices. Containment was no longer something to debate. It was something to administer. Citizens were no longer asked to agree. They were asked to trust. Trust the planners, trust the experts, trust the institutions built to manage risk. Eisenhower did not invent this logic, but he normalized it. Legitimacy without consent is fragile in ways that competence cannot repair. When procedure replaces persuasion, power becomes self-justifying. Eisenhower understood nuclear weapons. He grasped their destructive potential better than most civilians ever could. He wanted to avoid nuclear war. But nuclear deterrence produced a paradox. It eliminated decisive victory. Containment plus nuclear weapons meant permanent standoff, endless vigilance, and no exit strategy. The bomb did not resolve conflict. It froze it. Eisenhower's farewell address is often treated as an act of moral courage, but timing matters. He delivered his warning after 8 years in office, after overseeing the consolidation of the system, and after choosing management over dismantlement. He named the danger, he described the incentives, but he offered no structural reversal, no demobilization, no dismantling of permanent institutions, no exit from containment. Warnings delivered after authority is exercised are not resistance, they are reflections. One of the least comfortable consequences of permanent emergency is that moral and legal classifications themselves become tools of management. After Germany's surrender in 1945, millions of soldiers were administratively reclassified not as prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces, a distinction that allowed normal protections under the Geneva Convention to be suspended in the name of logistical necessity and control. The scale and severity of suffering in these camps remain debated among historians, and there is no credible evidence of exterminatory intent. However, Germans under Eisenhower were treated the worst. What is clear, however, is that emergency logic did not immediately recede with victory. Administrative convenience, operating within a system accustomed to governing without limits, was permitted to override established norms. This episode matters not because it just reveals cruelty, but because it reveals how easily procedure can displace moral judgment once crisis becomes permanent. What this episode ultimately reveals is not a failure of character, but a failure of limits. Eisenhower did not rule through cruelty, fanaticism, or impulse. He ruled through prudence, through administration, through systems designed to function smoother under pressure. But systems built to govern emergencies do not automatically know when the emergency has ended. They retain the habits that made them effective: classification, discretion, insulation from public judgment. What begins as temporary necessity becomes routine procedure, and routine once established rarely feels dangerous. This is not the deeper legacy of the permanent emergency, not that leaders become tyrants, but that governance becomes technical, procedural, and self-justifying. Decisions are no longer weighed primarily as moral acts, but as logistical problems. Law becomes flexible, categories become adjustable, responsibility becomes diffuse. Eisenhower believed that responsible men, acting prudently, could manage dangerous systems indefinitely. He was not alone in that belief, and he was not reckless in holding it. But permanent emergency absorbs moderation. It converts restraint into legitimacy. It allows power to persist without needing to persuade. Eisenhower's tragedy is not that he failed to dismantle the system. It is that his competence helped stabilize it. Systems built to manage crisis do not collapse under recklessness. They endure under good leadership. And once crisis becomes permanent, escape is no longer a matter of intention, but of structure. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis worthwhile, a like or subscription helps more than you might think. Future episodes will continue building on these ideas.